Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery, and today we're going to be taking a full small details look at this tremendously cool knife. This is the Urban EDC LC, or Light Compact. I am so freaking excited to try this, and this entire time we're going to be comparing it, of course, to this. This is the Trevor Burger Urban, or sometimes called the Urban SFL for slab frame lock, because that's what Trevor Burger calls his frame lock knives if they are not contoured. We'll also probably compare it occasionally to this. This is the Trevor Burger LEXK in the CFL. This is a frame lock that is contoured. He does make an SFL version of this that'll be more like that, but there's differences, and we'll talk about that as we go. At first glance, these two knives look identical. Yes, obviously this one has a micarta show side, but there's a version you can buy of this that has a full titanium on both sides. It would look much more similar. But if you take a really close look, there's actually a ton of little difference between these two that I think is going to make it a really interesting comparison. A lot of those differences are going to be purely cosmetic. Some are mostly cosmetic, but maybe a little bit functional, or functional for some people. And then a couple of them I think actually kind of matter or make a difference. And on most of those, it's going to err in the favor of the custom, because you would hope so, right? The custom costs literally twice as much money. But there's actually a couple of things that the production version is doing that I think are done better. And so that's really, really interesting to see, and something I wasn't quite expecting. Another thing that's really important to note about this, and just kind of get into the backstory a little bit, is that generally speaking, if you have a custom knife and a production version of that knife, that's the order it came in. The custom made came first, and then the production is a production run trying to emulate the custom. But it's actually the opposite here. This knife started its life as a production knife collaboration with Urban EDC Supply. That's where the whole name came from too. This is of course the Urban EDC SFL, and this is Trevor Burger Urban. But this is where it began. It began as this design to be made as this production knife. And the customs actually came later, because Trevor said that he liked the design so much that he wanted to try making some customs. Now, he started off by just making a limited batch of 50 that were numbered. This one is number 4, but it's not written anywhere on it, because my friend that I bought this off of is as picky as I am in terms of having no, what do you want to call it, billboarding anywhere on the knife. But you can see from my COA, this is number 4. But he's continued making a couple of these. But what that means is that it's kind of hard to know how these things happen. Normally, if there's a difference between a production version and a custom knife, it's, differences that they dropped to keep costs down, little details that they had to drop, or things that they had to change in order to kind of accommodate mass production, or things that just don't really matter, but change because it's the way that the OEM is more used to doing things. But that, again, isn't the case here. They happen in the opposite order. And so it's really interesting to see what things actually changed and trying to, deduce why. I actually sent Trevor a bunch of detailed questions asking him how this evolution came. How did he approach designing this in the first place? Because this is the first time that he's ever designed a knife for production first. And so I asked him how would he approach that, and how would it differ from the design process if he's trying to design a custom knife. And I asked him about some of the small details that I noticed that are different between these two and what order they came in. Is it something that was part of this design initially but got dropped, or is it something that wasn't ever part of this that he added on these, or did he intentionally hold it off so that he could add it onto these and make these a little bit fancier? He actually said that he would get back to me with as he put it, detailed response, but he wasn't able to get back to me in time for me to film this video. So I'm going to go ahead without it, point out some of the things that I think are important to note, and if I can, I'm going to film additional content when he does get back to me that I'll try and splice in later. Okay, let's start comparing these blades. I usually start with the blades in these reviews anyway, but this is by far the #1 biggest difference between these two knives. This is also the difference that I was genuinely shocked to see. But my shock comes a lot from the principle of the fact rather than the actual function. So let's talk through what's going on here. On both of these knives, we have I'm just to go ahead and just say full-on identical dimensions on this perspective. They have the exact same lengths, exact same heights. The curve that they follow is exactly the same. They are identical in this dimension. They're also identical in this dimension. These are exactly 0.127 blade stock on both of them. What's different between them? Well, for one, the finishes. On this, we've got a hand satin, and Trevor Burger is known for this really, really gorgeous hand satin, but that's not my favorite blade finish, as pretty as it is, because I love a user finish, and these are just kind of the opposite. And on this one over here, we have a really, really nice stonewash. I love the stonewash that Riot does. It's this kind of glowy, still very reflective version of a stonewash. Let me see if I can show you just how reflective it is. Yeah, it's still very, very reflective, and it just has a very nice even thing. So I personally love the finish over here and like to see it. On the other versions of this, they still didn't do this. They have the capability going through Riot to make the knife look exactly like this if they wanted, because Riot does a very, very nice hand satin, but they did a belt satin on the full tie version, which is a little bit surprising to see. And they did a black wash on the full blacked out version, and that's not surprising at all to see, because of course they're going to black the whole thing out. But the bigger difference, the much, much bigger difference here, is the grind itself. I was astonished to see that they put a flat grind on this knife. It's a freaking burger, okay? And so this is where I kind of get. So there's going to be an actual functional difference between these two grinds. Yes, there's also just kind of the principle of the fact. Let's first get into the functional difference. They both come from the exact same top blade thickness, and so how thin they get behind the edge is going to be a matter of how aggressively they swoop down, and how thin they stay for how long is going to be a matter of what kind of grinds these are and how aggressive those grinds are. This one gets very thin behind the edge. This comes down to 15 to 16 thousandths behind the edge, and that means if you look down here, this is like, can I get that to focus? That's wicked, wicked thin. And it stays thin for a very long time, because Trevor Burger is known for having really tall, really deep hollow grinds. Now, this particular one isn't quite as deep, so it doesn't stay as thin for as long as the full LEXK, the full-size LEXK drop point that I did a small detailed review on. That one stayed thin for insanely long periods of time, but this one stays thin for a very long time. This is a spectacular hollow grind, as Trevor Burger is known for. And so it starts very, very thin and stays thin for a long time. This is a full flat grind, and it comes down to about 20 thousandths behind the edge. And so if this didn't exist and I wasn't comparing it against this, I would say, yeah, this is great. This is, this is the kind of, exactly the kind of stuff you'd like to see on an EDC knife. It's got relatively thin blade stock, 0.127. It's got relatively thin behind the edge, 20 thousandths. And so with a full flat grind there, this is going to slice wonderfully. And it does. And so from a functional perspective, this is still a spectacular cutter. And so if you're considering not buying this because of a cutting performance, I think you'd still be incredibly happy with this. Could they make it even more aggressive and get this down to 15,000 behind the edge? Yes, I think so. Riot, I think, is capable of that. And would that make it enter into materials a little bit better? Sure, but then it would be also facing a slightly more aggressive, steeper grind, so a little bit more resistance as it goes, because it has to come to the same blade stock. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, this is still going to be a spectacularly slicey knife. And this is a prototype, and so it's not just a loaner, so I was not supposed to do anything that would meaningfully change the condition of it. So I put it through very light cardboard use, and it still slices fantastically well. But this does slice better. This enters into the material better, and it also stays thinner for longer, and so this continues feeling slicey for better. But again, I was trying to compare light cardboard to light cardboard, and that's the kind of thing where a hollow grind actually cuts perfectly fine. The thing, the way that the geometry works, on a flat grind, it has a constant ramp. That is, as you're pushing material, as you're cutting through material, that material has to splay to the side and distort and to make room for the blade. And on a flat grind, as you're coming up this, it's pushing the material out of the way at a constant rate. And so that's actually pretty darn easy to do. And if you have a very dense material, like something like double-walled cardboard, flat grinds tend to cut a little bit better because they are pushing that material at a consistent rate. hollow grinds work great for thin and flexible materials because on a hollow grind, they start very thin, they stay very thin, so they're cutting really, really well, and then they suddenly ramp up much more quickly. And that much more quickly curved ramp means that it's trying to distort the material out of the way faster. And so these types of blades tend to have a little bit more resistance as you're pushing through denser materials. And so for some kinds of cutting, this is actually going to perform better. For some kinds of cutting, this is going to perform better because a lot of cutting that I do anyhow, really only uses the tip of the blade. Either, you're cutting through something like thin string or rope, something that's going to be completely split before you get further up the blade, or rather than cutting through cardboard in this dimension, you're cutting through cardboard in this dimension, or cutting just like the tape on a box, or something that is also going to be split before you ever make it all the way up further on the blade. And so knives, that type of cutting always is going to cut better with a hollow grind because it just is so much thinner for so long and you're only using that thin portion. Okay, so from a functional perspective, recap, this is still a fantastic slicer. And if you're worried about that, and especially if you're doing the kind of cutting that where a full flat grind will be a better cutter to begin with, don't worry about it. This is going to be great. If you're the type of person that loves and knows that your cutting really works for hollow grinds, it's kind of sad to see they dropped it. Now let's finally get to the principle of it. I can't believe they dropped the hollow grind. What? Why do I react that way? And the reason is because Trevor Burger knives always have hollow grinds. I think they literally always have hollow grinds. I've dug back through the archives on Blade Gallery and Arizona Custom Knives and all sorts of stuff for as far back as I can find Trevor Burger making knives, and I'm pretty sure every single one of them has a hollow grind. Some have a shorter hollow grind because things like this is, that LEXK, this one is the version with the sheep's foot, so it's not a full tall one, but they all do. I could be wrong. Maybe he has made knives that don't have it. But even if you go further back to when Burger Knives wasn't Trevor, it was his father, Fred, those also had hollow grinds. The original versions of the EXK have full tall hollow grinds. And in fact, the Excalibur production version done through Boker has a freaking hollow grind. It's just such an iconic part of what I think of with Trevor's knives. And he does such a good job of it. I raved about this so much in my small details reviews of this knife and the sheep's foot version that he does so good at a hollow grind that it's become something that I associate as what stands out as a Trevor Burger knife. What makes his knives good, not just that he has wonderful, sleek, minimal design, but from a functional perspective, what makes them so outstanding is partly that. And so when I learned that they're going a production version of this, and I learned that it was, likely going to be through Riot, and it turns out it is through Riot, I thought, great, because Riot is the only OEM I would genuinely trust to be able to pull this off. Not as good as Trevor does it. Trevor does spectacular, stunning hollow grinds, but Riot is one of the few OEMs that not only can do hollow grinds, a lot of OEMs these days don't want to or can't do them, but they also do really, really good, really, really tall ones. And so it just feels like they had the capability, because they have the capability to both do a tall hollow grind and a hand satin finish, they could have literally made a blade that looks almost exactly like this. They could have made a knife that looks almost exactly like this, and they chose not to. And again, from a functional perspective, for some people, this will genuinely be better. And that little additional thickness behind the edge is maybe a very positive thing for you. Maybe you want that extra little bit of stability there. But to me, the principle of the fact feels like morally wrong. That argument is not going to compel to a lot of people. I get that some people are just going to say that I'm being obnoxious. But to me, it feels blasphemous almost to make a Trevor Burger knife and not put a hollow grind on it, especially when they could have through the OEM that they did. Okay, moving on. What else is different about these blades? The only other thing that's really different, because everything else is identical in shape and dimensions, everything like that, is how this plunge grind is done. And you can see that on the production version of the plunge grind itself, we're talking about this grind here, the thing that takes it from the full thickness down to the thinnest behind the edge, that the entire thing starts a little bit further forward. It's minor, but it starts slightly higher up. But more importantly, the length of the plunge grind, how long it takes to drop down is markedly better done here on the custom. This version is tremendously done. It's a very short drop off, and so it reaches that full thinness all the way up here. You've got all of this room to sharpen. And because this does get so thin and stay thin for so long, this part down here is very, very, very thin. This entire bit is very, very thin. And so sharpening is going to be tremendously easy. It's very little resistance. Now over here, unfortunately, not only does this grind start up a little bit higher, but it comes and it doesn't end until right here. And so it's already hitting just this tiniest little bit of a smile. Oftentimes on knives where the plunge grind ends at the end of the blade coming straight from the factory, you don't see a smile. You instead see a very mild recurve where it dips down at the very end. And that's what we're seeing right there. It's just the tiniest little nick on the corner. So the reality is you won't be able to sharpen this without moving further up this plunge grind. That's disappointing to see. I've seen Riot do it better on some, do it better and worse on others. And it's interesting that there is so much variance coming out of Riot. I think it often comes down to the location and angle of this, which is why I also was surprised to see this pulled up a little bit further. I think that they should move this line right here further back, closer to this handle scale, and then be able to scoot that entire plunge better. And so I think they could do it better. But I do also want to point out that don't go thinking that if you go spend twice the money on this custom that you're guaranteed to have a better plunge grind, because this one is spectacular. But I've seen other ones that are up on Trevor Burger's like subsection on Blade Gallery, for example, where they are themselves. They have a much shallower plunge, a less aggressive plunge, and they are themselves already smiling right there on the Blade Gallery photos. And so I think this is the kind of thing where it's a little bit hit or miss. This particular version has a spectacular grind, but they don't all. Okay, so there is another difference about the blade when it comes to how this front flipper is done and how the jimping is done, but we're going to save that until we start talking about the action. So let's instead move back to the handles. And again, this is the kind of thing where at face value, these handles look so freaking similar to each other. And in so many ways, they really, really are. But there are little differences throughout. The first one I'm going to point out is the thickness, because they're actually different thickness. This one is 0.43 and this one's 0.45. So that's, 0.2 of an inch. It's a very small amount, but it's the kind of thing where if you put them butt to butt, you can actually see the difference. Yeah, look at that. It is a little bit thinner. And I usually say thinner the better, but this is the kind of case where the actual shape and size of this, I think I actually like the minutely thicker handle here better. This feels spectacular in my hand. I love this knife. I love the way it feels in my hand, but this production version fills my hand in a way that is just, a little bit more satisfying. I genuinely like it better, a tiny bit thicker. And it's such a small difference that they're still very both thin knives. They're going to carry very, very well. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the places where I think this is actually a little bit of production win for the production. Since the blade stock itself is exactly the same, that extra thickness is coming entirely from the scales themselves. Each scale is slightly thicker. This is 0.13 and this is 0.15 per scale. And so that's going to come in a couple of different places. And I think the first place that we're actually... The main thing that's going to happen is how this impacts our lock bar. So let's start talking about the lock bar, because there's another really fundamental difference about the lock bar itself, and that is the shape on this dimension. This is something that I wasn't surprised to see change, because when I talked at the intro, I talked about how sometimes the changes you see in a production version are things where the OEM is just used to doing it a certain way. They've nailed down the geometry to have lock bars work a certain way, and so they want to do that in all of the knives if they can. And this is the kind of thing I expect falls into that camp. This style of lock bar, the very tall, thin lock bar that curls up around the top, is something that I think Trevor's done on all of his knives, most of his knives, certainly all of his knives recently. And one of the things that does is that means that there's less material in this dimension that makes it just a little bit more flexible. And so the first thing I'm going to note here is that between the height here and the extra thickness of the scale, this lock bar is just easier to push over. This is a lighter lock bar strength. Over here, by comparison, this is just significantly firmer. They both have this lock bar relief that's cut pretty darn similarly, but you can see it's very subtle, but the lock bar relief itself is cut a little bit thicker on this one too. And so there's more material here. So between more material here, and more material in this dimension, this lock bar is just less flexible and requires more force to push it out. We're going to come back to that when we talk about other differences on it. But I also want to continue from this dimension, what impact this will have on your use of the knife. And so right off the bat, it's a common thing for lefties to have difficulty holding a knife if they're going to flick it. We're going to talk about the flickability. I know this is a front flipper, but this is a flickable knife. And it's common for lefties to have difficulty when flicking it because flicking a knife because they have to keep their thumb off of the lock bar. Any additional strength usually locks it up. And so the thinner that you make this, the easier it will be for left-handed people to keep their finger off. And you can see, yeah, it's just there's more space to put your thumb. But this impacts the 90% of us that are right-handed people as well, because the fact this is a top flipper or front flipper. So when you're doing a front flipper knife, normally on like on any other kind of knife, you're going to hold it like this for like a flipper tab, you have a really secure grip. You're going to hold it like this for a thumb flick, you have a really secure grip. But on a front flipper knife, you're doing this weird claw grip thing at the front of your hand, and it's awkward, and it's not easy for a lot of people to hold. It's like one of those things that requires some amount of hand dexterity. And so by keeping this very slim like this, he's giving you more room for you to put your finger on here and be able to hold this in whatever way makes it feel comfortable and secure in your hands. It's not going to fly out. You can see that where I'm pinching this right now, my finger would be touching the lock bar if I was on the other version. And sure enough, if I come over here, my finger naturally falls on this lock bar. Now, with the way that I hold front flippers and the way I've taught myself to hold front flippers, I barely put fingers on the scale at all. I mostly hold the knife pinching against the pocket clip down here. And so I don't personally find this one problematic at all, but I know a lot of people have difficulty with front flippers, period. And so this extra height here could impact some people. And since this is a knife, since on front flippers, you don't want a strong detent because you want to be able to kind of manipulate everything in a way that's not going to make it fly out of your hand. Putting your finger there is not, this isn't a knife that's going to lock up at all, but it is from lock bar pressure, but it is going to make it harder to use. Talking about that lock bar a little bit more though, this is one of the things that I was actually really kind of surprised to see, and I think is really, really cool. This is so slim in this dimension that there's no way you're going to mill it out. But in general, people don't really mill out lock bars. They did over here, and that was really interesting to see. This isn't the only knife to have weight relief milling, pocketing right here on the lock bar. It's not the first time that this has been done, but it's pretty freaking rare that that's done. And so it's really neat to see that. And that's a cool weight relief detail that they added onto the production that isn't on the custom. And in fact, they expanded the weight relief in general. Right off the bat, one of the things that made the Trevor Burger Urban stand out from his past knives is just look at the ridiculous amount of weight relief in here. This thing is so exceptionally skeletonized. And if you compare that to his older knives, yeah, there's just none. This is a flat slab. Now, this is not a SFL, it's a CFL, but from the inside, it's just completely slab right there. Now, he has actually, since making this, backported this to these knives. And if you get a modern version of an LEXK SFL, he has very similar pocketing inside. And so that's really cool to see that they made those lighter. But this is one of the things that made this knife so incredibly impressive, because this is I believe a 3-inch blade, but this is only 2.5 ounces. And so it's very, very light, and it's all due to that wonderful skeletonization. And where that puts the balance point is right here, right at this kind of nub spot. And now it could be a little bit further forward, but it's still at a point where it feels very, very nice and nimble in your hand. I was really curious to see how they'd carry that over for the production version. And the reality is they kept that nearly identical milling pattern inside, but they actually expanded it in a couple places. You can see that this part right back here actually dips over even further. And they also expanded the milling pocket over here. And so this one is actually more milled out. And because they added the milling there, this version is meaningfully lighter. Now, it's kind of hard for me to do an apple-to-apples comparison because this version is also micarta handle, and because it has an inlay, they can't mill out that part, but they could have kept the pocket in that's right there. But this micarta is not, milled out at all. So I didn't know how that was going to balance. Like, it's a lighter material by far, but there's no pocketing whatsoever. But the reality is this version is 2.36 ounces. So that's a 3-inch blade and 2.36 ounces. That's incredibly light. I was really blown away, especially given that it was a little bit thicker. I thought that would all add up to maybe being a little bit, at least the same, if not maybe a little bit heavier than I expected. This is such an exceptionally light knife, and I think they did such a great job on that. And the other thing is that the balance point is just a little bit further up on this one. And this is basically like, maybe like a hair further would be absolutely perfect, but this is an even better balance than on the custom version. And everything about this just feels so like incredibly impressively lightweight, but in a way that is still very, very sturdy. It doesn't feel like a flimsy kind of featherweight knife. It just feels featherweight in terms of how nimble and kind of light it feels in your hand. While we're looking inside the knife, you can see, well, maybe you can't see. Let me try and reflect some light up in right there. Maybe if I zoom in. Yeah, okay, so it's common for Urban EDC to put some kind of hybrid logo inside, but only if the logos themselves, well, first of all, if there is a logo, and then if the logos correspond. Urban EDC's logo is a compass, and it's a round, and so if they have a round logo on the other side, they'll try and merge the two together. But this is the little TBC cross Urban EDC. Love to see it. Moving back to the backspacer, this is one of the things where I think they actually did a better job, or not a better job. I think the design itself is better on the production version than on the custom. From this dimension, they are exactly the same. Actually, talking about the backspacer, this is one of the things that made me, the reason why I had to buy this off of a friend rather than get in on their pre-order itself is because I talked myself out of getting in on this originally because of this dang backspacer. I personally don't love lanyard holes. I don't want lanyard holes. And Trevor has never, I don't think ever, had lanyard holes on his knives. Maybe there's some in the archives, but the modern day knives of his just don't have any. And so I was kind of frustrated, and it felt a little bit blasphemous. Again, I was being too righteous about this stuff, but it felt wrong to have a lanyard hole. I just didn't want a lanyard hole. And I also don't like when a lanyard hole backspacer sticks up above the rest of the knife, because it means that the pressure from the back of the knife is put on an even smaller portion of material, which is going to be just less comfortable. Once I got this in hand, I'm really glad I went for it anyway, because this is a total non-issue. This is so well rounded back here, and everything about this is so nicely done that nothing is sharp. Sometimes it also introduces sharp corners when they do that, but this feels spectacular in your hand back here. And from this perspective, everything that is functional about this backspacer is exactly the same over here. It feels exactly the same in your hand, gives you the exact same amount of clearance. They are exactly the same thickness and dimensions everywhere. The reason why I said this one's better, because look what happens at the butt end. Yeah, this one extends further down. So even though there is more material back here, this one has a better balance point and less weight. But the reason why this is better is because look what it's doing for the tip of the blade. Now in both of these, the tip of the blade doesn't stick out the back, but the blade to handle ratio on these is so good that technically speaking, if you're running your finger through here, like I can touch it. This is not something I'm saying I'm worried about. I'm never going to run my finger in some kind of weird way that makes me touch this. But over here, they've extended the backspacer in this really tiny little bit right at the end that just completely hides it. And so, like, I don't think it's a problem, but this just is better. It has no downside. There's absolutely no negative consequence to this whatsoever, and it just guards that tip from ever being a problem. So this is something that I would love to see him do. I was genuinely surprised that this isn't something he's done on the modern customs, because I figured maybe this is a change that he made after the initial version of the design, after some kind of back and forth on the prototypes. And I thought that he would have carried that over to the modern versions of these, because he's still making these. And this is from the very first batch, but he's still doing it. And no, he's still keeping this version. So that's one of the things I asked him about. If I get an answer back, I'll try and pop that in. But this is just across the board a little bit better. Moving back to these clips, this is another case where they look identical at first glance, and for the most part they are identical. There are little differences throughout them though, and this one actually works a little bit better, the one on the custom version. The first thing I'm going to say that's different about them is the height of them. It's tremendously similar, but the height of this one is ever so slightly. It's a hair. It's like 15 thousandths is what I measured it at, taller in terms of how far it sticks off of the handle. And then the bigger thing though is that it's a thinner piece of material right here. So when you combine the fact that it comes out a little bit farther and it's thinner right there, you just have more pocket clearance here. Now the pocket clearance on this isn't bad whatsoever. It's just ever so slightly better on this one. In fact, to your eye, you might not be able to tell the difference, but that's the kind of thing where like it's ever so slightly better. The bigger thing though is that the thinner amount of material right here means that this one just is a lot nicer in terms of a spring ability. This one is just spring, and it just slides in and out of the pocket very, very easily. This one, by comparison, because this material is just a little bit thicker here, this is pretty stiff. And so while it works really, really well from a ramp perspective, and overall, I want to say this pocket clip actually works fantastically, this one just slides in and out of the pocket a little bit easier. It still has enough spring and tension to stay in place, but I had to struggle just a little bit more. The other thing where this is going to perform slightly better, if you look up here, the geometry from this dimension is the same, but the geometry is not the same from this dimension. Ooh, that's not going to be easy to show. What we can see here is that this is a perfectly flat slab. So this is the flat material right there. And so this is a flat contact point this entire way. And what that means is that if you are sliding in and out of this in this direction, which is the direction you're mostly doing all of your motion when you're sliding in and out of your pocket, it's going to encounter just these ramps. But if you're doing any kind of like side to side drag as you're pulling out of your pocket, or if you have it in your pocket and you're trying to scoot it around for some reason, what you're going up against is just a 90-degree angle, and that's going to be more likely to bunch. Over here on the custom version, you can see that he actually has curved this in as he goes. Yeah, that curves downward. And so this is curved on this dimension, but it's also curved on this dimension. And partly that is just a nicety aesthetic, small detail that makes this feel even more fancy and custom. But that curvature as you enter in right there means that if you do slide up at an angle as you're pulling out, or if you do have to try and slide it back and forth, it's not going to bunch up at all. And it's just going to move around in your pocket a little bit better. This is next level type of detail stuff. Like, are you going to really notice this in your pocket as you go? Not really, not as you go day to day. This is the last mile. What are you getting for your twice the price? You are getting a more fancy, more complicated, and slightly nicer pocket clip. The other things that you are also going to see is that the way that they did the back here is a little bit different. Get that to focus. Okay, so this one again is a flat slab up to there, and then there's a little bit arc right there. And this one is an arc further back. The other difference here is that, so that's just going to be aesthetic. Like it looks one way or another. But this one actually is, like, this post part here is a tiny bit shorter than the post part here. It's very subtle. It's about 10 thousandths or a tenth of an inch. But the result is that this one sits, because that comes up a little bit higher, this one sits a tenth of an inch shorter in your pocket. Yeah, are you going to be able to tell the difference between this and this in your pocket? No. But is this slightly better? Technically, yes. Coming up to the front, one of the differences that we find is that the pivot on the production version has a pivot collar and just a cooler looking pivot. And this is one of the things where I think the production is just better. I think it's just cooler. I think it both looks nicer and just kind of is nicer. It also is a flatter pivot. It doesn't stick out quite as far. And in this one sticks out. And so I don't mind the pivot on this whatsoever, but it's just not as cool as this. Now, he has done versions of his customs later on where he added a pivot collar and made this a little bit smaller. And so you can get custom versions that have something close to this, but they don't have this cool, like, shape. I don't know what you call that shape. They don't have this triangular-esque shape thing. And so there's just going to be a round thing with the collar around the outside. So this is one of the cases where across the board, I think the pivot is just neater. Now, luckily, the pivot on all of these is T8s. I say that's luckily because some of Trevor's, is this a T8 or is this a T10? Let me check that real quick. Dag. Okay, so this is a T10 and these are T8s. That is itself good. That's fine. I'm really pleased to see that. That's one of the things that was nicer about this than his old ones, because if you look at something like this is a freaking, I think that's a T5. Ugh, why? Might be a T6. Is it a T6? Nope, it's not a T6. I think that's a T5, and that on a pivot feels just horrifying. That's the thing that's going to require the most force of any screw in this entire thing, and the fact that it'd be so small. So the fact that he went up to a T10 is great, but it does mean you have two different screws here, and the fact that these are all T8s means that this is just less tools to disassemble. So again, a win for the production version. The other win for the production when it comes to the screws is that on the backs here, the screws are no longer there. Look at that. That's cool, right? So he did a really, really nice job of rounding off the tops of these so that they look beautiful. They don't have some kind of jagged screw, like kind of ugly screw tip that you would normally see. You can see the same kind of thing on like maybe like Herman's knives. But would it look better if they just weren't there? Yeah, and apparently you can. Now, that will be one of the reasons potentially why this scale is a little bit thicker. It's possible that they made this scale ever so slightly thicker to accommodate the fact that they wanted to make the screw not come out the other side, but have the enough depth to be able to catch. And I think that is almost assuredly the reason, because Riot is not going to be doing this. This would take way too much time for them to polish the tips of all the screws. That'd be an insane thing to ask an OEM to do. And so I'm almost positive that that is the reason why this scale is thicker. But like I said earlier, I kind of like that ever so slightly thicker quality to it. And I also like the fact that we just don't have this coming out the back end. Now, personally, if like on the full tie, let me back up a moment. On a version like this that has micarta in the handle, you could not invert the screws, because if you had the screws coming into here, you would need something in this for it to bite into. You can't bite into to micarta. You'd have to have some kind of titanium inlay or a tiny little bit, and that's really complicated. And so in this, I totally get why you would come in from this side and stick into this side and have it be flush. But on the titanium version of this, you could swap it. And on this one, you could swap it. In fact, even on this one with the screw showing, you still could swap it. And I still think it would look nicer. But especially if you do the version that doesn't pop out, I think it just makes more sense to have a completely clean show side and no screws popping out, and then have the screws show in the back where you're already going to have more clutter and screws everywhere. So anyway, point is they're not going to do some on this side and some on the other side. But if they had done just all tie versions of this knife, I personally think it would make more sense to swap this around. While we're talking about screws, the screw right here is another thing that I think they did nicer on the production version instead of over here. These are completely flush. And so it sits right in and it matches these completely flush, but it also matches this completely flush. And so this screw right here on the production version just lines up and is also flush. But for some reason, the screw right here is a little round head screw, like a little bubble head screw. And sure, it matches up with this bubble head, but like, I think this would just feel nicer and look a lot cleaner if they had used the same kind of screw over here. So this is a case where I think it's a win for the production. Another win for the production on here is how they're doing this lock bar insert. Now, I said earlier that the stiffness of this is pretty high. The reality is, because of detent engagement, if we look at where this is, you can see that it doesn't have very deep detent engagement. And so you probably don't want to lighten this lock bar, because you would with a light lock bar and low engagement, you have almost no detent. In fact, right now we have a very light detent, and this is something that I think they should probably improve, is to dial this up. I wouldn't dial it up by increasing lock bar pressure. So if you get one of these, I wouldn't recommend that you push this in, because it's detent that is light because of shallow engagement is something that lock bar pressure just doesn't really fix that much. And you end up adding a lot of resistance on close that you don't want, and you're never really solving the problem. The way you solve a problem like this is by making the hole bigger to allow the detent ball to sit deeper. And that's something that's a pretty complicated mod on your own to do, especially on something hard like M390, because you're trying to make a hole bigger, a very, 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 very precise amount. So that's something that really the OEM should do. If you're watching this, Urban EDC Supply, and if you still can make this change with Riot, I would encourage you to come up with a combination that is lighter here and deeper there. But anyway, let's say that it came too heavy. Let's say that you want to lighten this up and you want to bend this out. These knives have over travel stops, right? That's the lock bar insert there, comes down and sits right there. And that means you can't bend this past in a way that would spring it out, that would overspring the bar. But if you're trying to lighten the lock bar pressure, you want to overspring the bar. You're trying to do it in a controlled fashion, but it's a modification that you're trying to do, and you have to remove the lock bar insert to do that. And on a knife like this, where the detent ball, you can see there's no hole right there. That's another thing right off the bat. I think it just looks cleaner not having that hole right there. But by having because there's no hole right there, the detent ball is actually set into the lock bar insert itself. And so taking off this over travel stop is really, really easy. I didn't do it on this one because don't need to, and because it's a loaner and because it's a prototype. But all you'd have to do is take the screw off, and that lock bar insert will just fall off. Over here, we've got the lock, the hole is drilled into the tie itself, and so the detent ball is pressed into the titanium. If you see, there's a little ring around it, and that's because the detent ball is sitting in a pillar of titanium that is part of the lock bar, and then the lock face sits down on top of it. And the result of this, the fact that there is this screw here, but that it's sitting on top of this like column, means that this is exceptionally hard to take out if you don't know what you're doing, because any attempt to like pry this out or pop it out is going to like cock it one way or another as it's trying to come off that pillar, and it's stuck in place. I've taken this apart. I've lightened this lock bar pressure. We'll talk about that when we get to action, but it was a pain in the ass getting this off, and the only reason why I was able to get off is because I have the right tools to do it and I have the know-how to do it. Maybe I'll talk about that. I'll maybe just show that in this video when we get later on. But the reality is this one is a lot more complicated to mod. Well, it's harder to mod than it is this one. So both you get a cleaner aesthetic and it's easier to adjust it if you want. And so again, I think those are wins on the production version. While we're talking about the handles, you can see that this one has an inlay. This particular one is OD green micarta here and black micarta here. I love a stonewash finish. I love micarta. I love inlays. I love everything about this and would absolutely order this version. But I personally hate OD green. I know that's a controversial opinion. Most people love OD green, but I hate it. I also don't like OD green and black. Again, also controversial opinion. Many people will love this colorway, but this is what's killing me. If this was just all black, or if this was tie with a black insert, or if this was even if this was like the black and the natty or something, or even if it was OD green and natty, I think I would like it better than this particular colorway, but that is an entirely aesthetic thing. But this inlay here is pretty cool. And it's also really pretty odd to find a micarta inlay on a micarta scale. And so that's something that makes this knife stand out. So if you do like this colorway, this is a pretty rare combination to find, and it might be worth getting for that reason alone. This inlay itself, though, is something that he did start doing on later versions. Now, you can find versions of this knife that have full fat carbon handles. It's very similar to this now. But you can also find versions that are a slab and have a fat carbon or a micarta. I think I've seen those too, inlay. And it is the exact same pattern. And I think it looks really, really nicely. I think the curve here helps mirror the curve here. I think just generally this inlay looks aesthetically pleasing. I think it's balanced and it gives you this kind of faux bolster look. I do think the inlay looks really, really nice. Now, this version here, this micarta is relatively dry, and when the micarta is dry, it has a pretty light kind of color. And so these colors, I honestly don't know if these are going to show up more, the color difference here, or less when you get some oil on it. And if I just try and like wet it just a little bit, this is going to dry up just fine. But if I just put some water on it, you can see, yeah. So on the one hand, the distinction becomes more noticeable, but on the other hand, in some light, this is going to look just like layout. Like the moment I start putting this in shadow, I think those differences are almost completely gone. And these, another thing that I think is a little bit odd about this color difference, because it's like, these are just too similar in my mind. One of the tiniest differences between these two knives is the stop pins themselves. So this stop pin here is actually larger than your average stop pin. Most knives in this size, especially ones made by a Chinese OEM, are going to have a 3mm stop pin. That's pretty darn standard. This one is close to that. It's just slightly bigger at 3.17mm. So that's cool to see. But this one over here is bigger still, and it's done in a slightly fancier way. Let me put something underneath I think is going to make this focus a little bit better. Okay, so if I zoom in, you can see that this is actually a shouldered stop pin. And what that means is that it's thicker in the center than it is on the outside. Now, I didn't measure this when I took it apart, so I don't know what that inside measurement actually is, but this bigger part out here is 3.45mm. And so it's actually meaningfully thicker than your average stop pin. Now, if the inner part, the part that's actually in the scale, is still thinner, then if you're worried about shear strength, how much is it going to take to actually shear off that pin, that's going to be the same. But when you have a larger center part like this, and that's something you'll find even on like Hinders, that's how they achieve this. They'll have a shoulder stop pin with a bigger, thicker part in the middle. It just means that you have a thicker amount of material that's absorbing this impact force. And so it impacts the longevity of the knife. And since front clippers like this tend to have a really strong thwack compared to other methods of opening, it's cool to see that both of these knives have a slightly thicker and more robust stop pin than you would find on other knives. While we're talking about small differences, I want to talk about just the interesting geometry difference of what's going on up here. This isn't really functional. This is just intrigue. You can see that on the Riot version, this cut down here just transitioned directly into the lock face, and everything about this is pretty straightforward. You wouldn't really expect this to be any different, which is why it's interesting that this is different. There's this whole kind of cut in part right here that you wouldn't normally expect to see. And if we look, we can see that there is this little tiny corner cut off of the lock face right there. This is the same thing he did over here on the LEXK. You can see he's cut this back. And I explained in my video that what this is, I'm pretty sure, is a kind of odd and not super effective interpretation of a detent ball ramp. Because if we look at what's going on, where this lines up over here, wow, it's gonna be hard to see. Maybe if I reflect light up. This is running off the edge of that and kind of running up that ramp. I say kind of because if you look at where it's actually hitting, it's hitting right here at the very top. If it was hitting down here, then it would be acting as a ramp and going up this, but it's hitting right at the top of this. So it's only kind of acting different than if it was cut straight. And so this is something that I don't really understand why he keeps doing it, because if you made the angle, the ramp in this direction, then it would be impacting where the ball is hitting. But instead he's making the ramp in this direction and the ball just doesn't hit there. It hits down here, not there. So anyway, this one technically has kind of a detent ball ramp, but it's so not effective at that it feels like you're pushing up the same way that this one feels like you're pushing up. While we're talking about these scales, a really big difference that you'll notice is the finish. Let's see how well I can get that to actually show up. Yeah, okay. So this is a bead blast and this is a stone wash. And that in and of itself is actually really pretty interesting to me, because I don't know if I've ever seen a stone-washed titanium scale from Riot. I'm sure I have, but it doesn't come to mind, and I don't think I've seen it with any of the ones that they've done from Urban EDC. They've done a lot of bead blasted things, like the F5.5 I have as a bead blast finish, and so I was expecting this, since this is a bead blast, to be a bead blast over here too. But on this particular one, this is a stone wash. On the black washed version that has a black micarta, it is a black wash, which means it's been blackened in some way, some kind of coating, I don't know, and then stone washed. And the thing is though, the full tie version also looks to be stonewashed. I don't know. I asked Urban EDC for clarity and some kind of confirmation of whether or not that version was stonewashed too, because it looks exactly the same finish in their photos. I'll pop that in to show you. And what they said back to me is that according to Riot, the titanium version is quote unquote tumbled, whereas this one is quote unquote stonewashed. What? Like, is there actually a difference there? A lot of people use those terms as synonyms, and the reality is I would imagine they're the same finish. A stonewash is a tumbled finish where the tumbling media is a stone-like substance. It's sometimes, if you DIY, literally stones from your garden. If you're a big company like Riot, it's going to be some kind of ceramic-based tumbling medium, as opposed to metal or any other things that you can use for tumbling. So maybe if they're saying one is tumbled and the other one's stonewashed, maybe they're saying that the tumbling media they use is different. And that could mean that it has a slightly different, like, scratchy pattern. But they look the same to me. And that is suddenly one of the things that makes me really kind of want to get this, because I love stonewash finishes on handles. And while this is a beautiful bead blast, I love the way it feels. I don't regret this at all. I would like it better if it was a stonewash, because bead blasts can show snail trails. They're more resistive to snail trails than something like a sand blast, but they still can. And stonewash is never going to show anywhere ever. Like you'd have to really scratch this in order for it to really show up. And so I was surprised to see it. I love to see it. And it's really exciting me that the full-type version is also, if not this same finish, something tremendously similar. Now, the last difference between these handles I want to point out is actually, unfortunately, one of the bigger ones. And I say it's unfortunate because it actually, I think, does make a difference, and it's one of the things that makes this one a little bit worse. And what we're talking about here is the lock bar axis. And the big difference, sure, there's a difference on this side. The shape of this chamfer over here is different, and I think that part is reasonably negligible. This one's a little bit bigger and a little bit longer, so maybe that's even better on this side. But the big deal is that this scallop on this side is completely missing. Now, on both of these, he's following a handle pattern that he has done over on the EXK in the past. And what we're talking about is the fact that this cutaway here is shorter than this cutaway here. So the tip down here is actually in front of the tip up here. And what that means is that you have the ability to push on this nub. And so now, in addition to being able to come in here and push sideways and get in, you can actually push on this back corner. You can also see that he has the scallop right here giving you access, that ability to put your thumb into this and push on the side of the knife. That's the same thing he's doing over here, the scallop right there, and the ability to push your thumb into and push on the side of this lock bar. Over here, that scallop is missing. Sure, there is a nice micro chamfer the entire way that makes this not rough or anything like that, but you just don't have the same kind of access. I think you still have perfectly sufficient access in the sense that, like, I have no trouble pushing this over, but it's definitely noticeably less easy to push in. And you're definitely relying on this part here more than you are on the other knife, because on the other knife, you can push in on the side more. This is the kind of thing that doesn't really impact me because I have medium-sized glove hands and I have relatively thin fingers. And as a result, I don't usually have much trouble getting into these kind of small crevices here to open up knives, but people with larger hands often complain when knives have a relatively small distance here. I don't know how big of an issue this is going to be because these are relatively small knives to begin with, and so maybe the type of people that have considerably larger hands simply won't be trying to get in this knife in the first place. But the fact that this exists over here and is such a sufficient solution, it also doesn't feel negative in any way over here in this regard in terms of how much like handle space is supporting your fingers. I think they just should have done it. It just universally makes it easier to deploy. Now, I mentioned earlier that this lock bar is stiffer, and so when you combine those two things, the fact that it's easier to get in over here and it's a lot less force to push it out of the way, and this is harder to get in and a lot more force, yeah, this is the case where I think that this knife is this is meaningfully worse. Is it bad? No. Is it worse? Absolutely. Now, this is probably a good time to talk about the finishing on this knife because most of that is going to be reflected in the handles themselves, or at least the parts that we can compare. Now, you would expect the finishing on a $650 custom knife to be exceptionally well done. And when we talk about finishing, we're talking about all the small details, all of the little times that they put in chamfers in places, and then the actual like surface finishes themselves. And across the board here, everything is very, very, very nicely done, with, I guess, one exception. And it's kind of funny because this is one of the things that my friend Casper said to me when he got this knife. He's the one I bought this off of. He personally was really bothered by this line. Do you see that line right there? So this is a line that runs along the entire knife. It's along the entire side, and it's on both sides. And that is presumably a side effect of the machining. This is a leftover tooling mark from the way it was machined. Something about the mill bit that he was using at the time that he did this left this mark. And that drove Casper nuts. He said that for a knife at this price point, he didn't want to kind of like, I guess, settle for that kind of finishing. And it's funny because on the one hand, I totally get his argument. On the other hand, this doesn't bother me in the slightest. The fact that this is a custom knife means that things like that I kind of expect to find. I kind of expect to find slight imperfections that are kind of the mark of the maker, if you will, but also just because it's so symmetric, it kind of looks like a part of the design to me. But what Casper said at the time is that you just wouldn't find that kind of finishing on a Riot knife. And so I was super curious to see if we found it on a Riot knife, because that's exactly what we have here. Now, this is a stonewash finish, like I said, and so it's possible that that finish could cover this up slightly, but I don't think so. I think we would see a mark, and we don't. What we see is a stonewash finish over what appears to be a perfectly smooth surface. And so, yeah, sure enough, we don't see that kind of machining on a Riot version. Now, as far as other things go in terms of those little chamfers, that's one of those like last mile things that you get out of a Riot knife compared to other OEMs that cost less money. There are little micro chamfers along every single surface. Everything, there's no sharp corners anywhere. Everything is perfectly done. In fact, this chamfer here is meaningfully larger. You can see how thick that glowing line is than the version over here. This is a thinner little chamfer there. One of the few places where they added a chamfer in this they don't have over here is right here on the back spacer. Do you see that little glow line? That's them adding a chamfer on that inner part right there. And over here on the TBC, there is no, well, maybe there is. It's just it's either there is no chamfer or it's an incredibly small one. And so this is just more flush this whole way, as opposed to this has like an obvious little chamfer right there. But across the board, the finishing on these knives, the small details, the types of like, it's funny, I want to say that they're not cutting any corners, but the reality is they're cutting literally every corner by doing these little chamfers. But anyway, the ways that they're paying attention to all these little details and making sure that every single surface feels and looks wonderful all across the board is really, really nice. Oh, I did just notice the other spot. I forgot. The other spot that they added a chamfer is they chamfered this entire section. Like you can see right here, there is this little micro chamfer that runs the entire way. And he did not do that over here. Now, I think it doesn't matter. This doesn't really impact at all, but it is cool to see that they added that little extra detail. Anyway, you expect the finishing on these knives to be fantastic, and they are. Now let's finally start talking about the action on this knife. This is one of the things that it was pretty darn different between the two if you consider how this came versus how this came. But the reality is I've tuned this knife significantly to behave meaningfully different than the way it came. When this came, the lock bar pressure was a lot stronger. And so the result is that the detent on this was a lot stronger. And I felt it was too strong. Like I said earlier, you want a relatively light detent on a front flipper because you want to be able to have this spring out and not have a big, huge, ridiculous thwack as it happens because you're not holding on to just you have a relatively precarious grip. But the other thing is that it's just more comfortable if you have a slightly lighter detent on these type of things where you have relatively shallower nubs. And so on this, like I can push up on this and pop it out. And it's still got a firm detent, but I can do this relatively easily. When this came, I couldn't. This was firm enough that I had to push pretty hard to break it out. So what I did is I took this apart. I took that out, like I said earlier, and I bent this lock bar to make this just be a much lighter. And so the result is that now this is exactly where I want it, but this is meaningfully lighter than when it came. I still get a fantastic thwack, but it means that I can now do this super duper easily. And when it came, again, it was kind of grip. I now find this super duper easy. So when we come over here, this is the kind of thing where this was better, I think, from the get-go. The flipper tab itself is slightly differently shaped. It's the overall geometry is basically the same. This one just extends up to a more pointy corner. I thought initially that this came up higher, and I think it technically does because of this tiny little bit, but the reality is that these curves, these angles are the same on both these knives. This one just is less rounded off, and that's what makes it look like it's a little bit higher, and it might actually be a little bit higher, but it's very, very, very different. I mean, very small difference. But what it means is that this is a little bit easier to push on, just a little bit easier to push on from like a push perspective. But this one came with a light detent from the get-go. And I think it could be, I'm going to say it's verging on too light, but that light detent means that this is a a super ridiculously easy to actuate front flipper from the get-go. And so since I had to struggle with this one and adjust it, and some people will like the stronger detent, this is going to be slightly preference, but I think it personally was in need of change. And this one comes right off the bat in a state that I don't think needs to be changed at all. It could be a little bit. Where it does kind of matter is on the reverse flick. And you might be looking at this and going, how are you reverse flicking this? This doesn't have any kind of hole or spidey hole or thumb stud on the back. The reality is a lot of knives that don't look like they can be reverse flicked actually can be reverse flicked by using the blade tang itself. If the grind of the knife is exposed, that means that you have a ramp that you can push against to give you traction. Now, it's not the most intuitive grip. A lot of people are used to flicking a knife like this, kind of holding a knife, and you can on these to a degree. You can push in, you can flick out like this. I got it to work there. But I find these a lot easier to flick if you hold it instead like this. This is turning the knife upward, pinning it with your finger back there, and laying your finger along the spine like that. So now you're pressing your finger against this grind right here, and you are able to then like pull the knife out and as you flick, and it's just and I find it so good that even though this is one of the best front flipper actions, now that I've tuned it for my taste anyhow, this is one of the best front flipper actions I have in my collection, or that I've even experienced, period. I virtually always flick this knife. And over here, like one of the consequences of me lightening the detent on this is that this flick is still great, but it used to be exceptionally great because on a front flip, on a reverse flick, you can tolerate a little bit more detent strength, and you get a really nice like clacky open. This is still good, but it used to be spectacular in terms of that. Over here, you can still flick it. You can definitely still flick it. But that really light detent, the fact this is so light, means that you have to have good form. It's not going to be the kind of thing where you can just break a detent, because you have to, it's easy to pull it out past that detent on accident. You can absolutely flick it, but I think a little bit stronger detent would matter. But the other thing is, this is where that blade grind finally comes back in. So the other reason why I genuinely think this knife would be better, meaningfully better, I don't know, that's gonna be a you thing, but better if it had a hollow grind, is because hollow grinds make that flicking off the blade grind easier. If you think about what you're flicking against, when you're pushing against this surface right here, on a flat grind, here, let's just show that. On a flat grind, you've got a ramp. Sure, that's great. On a hollow grind, you have a sunken in ramp. And what that means is you're either pushing against this and trying to slide and not slide off it. You're trying to use the traction against this ramp to push, or you're pushing against this. And so the curl of a hollow grind catches your finger meaningfully better. And so hollow grind knives, the end result is that I don't think ever failed flicking this knife. Unless I'm doing something really, really weird, but if I'm just holding this the way I would expect to open it, I don't think I've ever failed this. Over here, even though we've got a stonewash finish, and the stonewash finish is going to give slightly better traction, I have occasionally failed this. It's not the kind of thing where it's hard to do, but it's just not quite as guaranteed. You have to be a little bit paying more attention to how you're holding the knife. Over here, you have more flexibility in just how precarious you hold it, because you are going to flick that out no matter what. And so this is the kind of thing where, again, it still works. It still works for this kind of action, and it still works well. I still think if you're someone that doesn't like front flippers but does like reverse flicking a knife, I think that you're going to still enjoy flicking this knife. But it would work better if it was a hollow grind. As far as closing action, this is one of the other things that really sets Trevor Burger apart. And his closing action is just absurdly smooth. It's not drop shutty. Like, it's not the kind of thing that's going to fall on its own, but it has such exceptionally low friction as you're going. It's maybe a high amount of, let me rephrase that, because definitionally this is all friction. It's maybe a high amount of force, but the sensation of it is like polished glass on glass. It's exceptionally, absurdly smooth. And so one of the things that I think makes owning a Trevor Burger custom really feel different from others is that absurdly smooth quality. And it's been like that on all of the ones that I've ever experienced. It's just so incredibly smooth. Now, by me lightening the lock bar strength on this one is also exceptionally low force. Like this one is, it's not free fall of its own weight, but it's the kind of thing where just like light shaking makes this go home. It did not come that way. When I first opened it up, it was a lot more force to close it, and you had to kind of push it, you had to kind of swing it more. And now with the way I have this tuned, man, it's just, it wants to close on its own. Over here, I was really curious to see how much they were able to recreate that, because Riot is really, really good at making smooth closing and low friction closing knives, but I didn't anticipate it would ever feel like a true burger. And yeah, I think that's exactly where this lands. So this is very smooth, very, very smooth. And if you've never experienced a burger, you would call this incredibly glassy. But can you feel it? Yeah, of course you can. Partly what's going on here is that this is a stone-washed finish, because a large part of how Trevor Burger is achieving this glassiness is by just the way he's finishing this surface up here. The part that the ball is sliding on has an incredibly smooth, low friction finish that has been very, it's not like literally polished, but it has no resistance to it. It has no bumps, no deviations as you go. And this, being a stonewash finish, is going to have, by definition, very, very small scratches on it as you go. And this doesn't feel scratchy. I was actually really impressed with how a lot of times knives that have a stonewash, you feel it a little bit more. It's just a little bit closer in the direction of gritty. And this is exceptionally smooth, but you do feel friction at all. Part of that is also going to be this lock bar strength. So like I said, the detent is light because of how the engagement is, not because of the strength of the lock bar. And so if they did it the other way around and had a light lock bar and deep engagement, then you would have even less force. And if you just kind of emulate that a little bit by like slightly pushing this over where it's still touching, but not, this is, yep, you feel that less. By just taking some of that force off of the detent ball, you do feel that surface less. But this is one of those things where at the end of the day, is this good in terms of closing action? Absolutely. This has like very light amount of force needed to close from the get-go. Like if you try and swing it close, it's super easy. Is it as good as this one in terms of now that I've adjusted it? Nope, this one's better. But is it better than this one came? Yeah. This is one of those things where out of the box, the opening action was easier and the closing action was easier. I had to tune this one to get it where it is, and this one came that way already. While we're talking about closing action, let's talk about the detent ball engagement. That's how far do you have to close the knife before you're up on the detent ball. And this is one of the cases where the production version is a little bit better. Trevor Burger has never had particularly early detent engagement, and this is almost exactly 20 degrees. That's pretty standard for the industry, so it's not like it's bad detent engagement, but it's not anything exceptional. This is also not anything exceptional, but it's better. It's 15 degrees. And so both of these cases, it's not hard to close the knife far enough to get up onto the blade, but it's just a little bit better on the production version. But I think for both of these, it doesn't really super matter, because at least for me, the way I close this is I always make it fall to my nail. And the way that this falls means that you're able to, well, I hold the knife like this with my thumb vertical. And so what falls is this little tiny groove right here. This top bit falls, and I fall right there into the spot. If your thumb is much thicker than me, maybe you would be falling on that. So maybe you'd want to have it hit like that. But in both cases, the blade is so thin that it just kind of bounces, and it doesn't feel like it's going to like chop my finger open or anything like that. On this version, it's the exact same thing. It falls down. Now there is this tiny little nub on both of these, and maybe if you hold it just the right way, I don't think so. I'm pretty sure that's going to slide past you no matter what. But so with both of these knives, I close it by letting it just fall to my nail, and it's just so easy to close after that. Now I wanted to talk about these flipper tabs a little bit longer in terms of kind of geometry and how that all works, because this is actually a very, very well balanced flipper tab, and it's kind of, I think, the Goldilocks between his two earlier flipper tabs, but he's able to do it in a different way. So on the LEXK and the EXK, you can see that he has this handle shape where the handle itself falls off as it goes. Like from this perspective, it is declining from this point forward. And as a result, he's able to have this in very, very small flipper tab, because as the blade is opening, the declining handle means that the flipper tab is still exposed, and so you're able to maintain traction and pressure on it the entire way. If the handle extended up straighter or was more symmetric, like it is on the Atlas, this small flipper tab would start being covered up as you go through, and you wouldn't be able to do that. So on the Atlases, he has to keep the flipper tab up taller. Up here, these are symmetric, but because of the shallowness of this angle right here, he's able to maintain a relatively small, it's slightly taller, but he's able to maintain a relatively small flipper tab, but still keep it exposed that entire path of travel. Now over here on the production version, because this is just a little bit pointier, that means that a little bit more of the tip is exposed, and so it's actually easier to maintain contact as you go, because as you're going past this top little hump, your finger is a little bit further up. And so that means that this is kind of the perfect Goldilocks between the Atlas and the EXK series. While we're talking about this flipper tab, in addition to the shape, the jimping itself is meaningfully different. And this is one of the things where I think the production version is actually better. Trevor Burger's jimping is extremely effective, but it's not the most comfortable in the world. Well, the reason why is because it's kind of deep. It's very tight together. And so pressing on it, you don't sink in too hard, but it's deep enough that you can kind of sink in here. And so especially when you go around these corners, bless him for wrapping his jimping all the way around the top flipper. So many people mess that up, but he gives you grip the entire way. But as you splay out around this corner, the pressing on this, it kind of hurts a little bit. So what we have over here is just really, really shallow version of that. The jimping is still very sharp, but it's extremely shallow. And so this is just more comfortable to press on. And so it still grips really, really well, but it just doesn't like kind of cut into you the exact same way. And on both of these knives, once you have it open, the jimping is so far back that it's not really, it's not something that I ever find functionally that I notice. This is the kind of thing where this one extends a little bit further up. And so it is maybe something that my thumb touches. I get the back of my thumb, but a lot of times I'm already past it. And so I think, especially over here, this is something that I don't think I ever feel this jimping when I'm actually using the knife. My finger's always past it. So this jimping is basically just for the opening action on this one. And this one, a little bit, but it's again, mostly for the opening action. So let's talk about ergos and grips before we get into my kind of final thoughts on this, because it all kind of leans into that. At the end of the day, man, this thing just feels so dang good in my hand. Trevor is known for not just having this gorgeous minimalist lines that have such a good balance to them. This is one of the more geometric shapes that he has by having this like kind of sharper corner here rather than the curves that he has on the Atlas or the EXK series. But everything about it, even though this is more geometric, is still so elegant. And the way it fills your hand, it's neutral, but not. It's neutral enough that it's not going to feel like it's one of those things that's forcing you into a particular kind of grip, but it has just the right amounts of curves and just the right amount of spaces, and it just melts into my hand. I love the way this feels so dang much. This curve along the back here is subtle, but it fits into your hand just perfectly. And everything back here lines up exactly what you want. Like I said earlier, this thing doesn't bother me whatsoever. It's usually a cardinal sin for me, but it doesn't bother me whatsoever. And it feels so good in a pinch grip. My finger nestles right there. I love this. I would love to see someday a version of this knife that has this kind of more sheep's footy blade shape, but even this with this overall type of sweeping up belly drop point, I still find this so tremendously good to use in a pinch grip and for utility cuts because everything the way just fits in my hand so well. Now I said that this version, the ever so slight, maybe imperceptible to some people, thicker handle, filled out my hand a little bit better. And everything else about the ergos is exactly the same. The ergos on this are just a dream. And the fact that he kept the blade, the weight so light, not just as light, but even lighter, and the distribution a little bit better, means that this is, I cannot tell you how good it feels to hold and use and actually kind of press on and cut with this knife. I've done markedly less cutting than I have with this one, but I've used this one a lot, and I just absolutely adore it. I have medium-sized glove hands, and this is a 4-finger grip with just a slight bit of room right there. But Kev is the person who had this one before me, and he also has one of these, and he says that on his large size hands that this is still perfect size grip for him and melts into his hand. And so I think it will work for people that even have bigger hands than me, but this is the knife that for me and my hands is exactly the size I want. And this is one of the things that made me so interested in this to begin with, and why I'm so glad that this is a version that's more available, because if you look to his customs, he has 2 sizes. He has the EXK and he has the LEXK. And they're a little bit too far apart in my opinion. This one is on the upper end of what I want in a knife. This is 3.375 inches. I like 3 to 3 1/4. And so this is still great, but it's just a little bit above. But then if you go down to the EXK, that is suddenly now a 2.75 inch blade. And that is, again, well, it's even more outside of my range than the other one. And so that one's a little bit too small. And the Urban and the Urban LC, Urban EDC LC production version is that perfect Goldilocks. This is a 3-inch blade. And I think it's just kind of perfect. I think it's kind of perfect for a small knife. It's exactly where you want it to be. It's not too big. It's not too small. Everything fits so well. And that's going to segue into my final thoughts. Now, I've had this knife here for quite some time. The unboxing, I don't think I ever made it up. I'm going to find it. I'll put it up. But the reality is I got this many, many months ago. I think it's been 4 or 5 months at this point. And it didn't take very long. But in that time, this has become one of my favorite knives, period. Full stop, end of sentence. Not even within limiting it to like the EDC category or the small knives category. This is just one of my absolute favorite knives, period. I think it is so exceptionally well done, so exceptionally well balanced. And part of that is, of course, the execution. Yes, he did an exceptional job with this knife. But most of that is just the design itself. And in almost every way, that is completely carried over here. And so there are things about this knife that I would do different. I would make this a hollow grind. I just would, from a principle of the matter factor perspective, and also just for my particular kinds of cutting, I like hollow grinds better. And for the reverse flick action, it would make it slightly better. But aside from that one real thing, I think this knife is still every bit that knife. This is still that same knife, and it feels so dang good. I am so glad that this exists in the world, because these are really hard to get. They're really hard to come by, and they're really expensive. This is a $650 custom knife. And yeah, these are expensive. These are, I forget, they're just under $300 on the pre-order, like $289 or something like that. And they're, or maybe $299, something like that. And they are going to be 15% more expensive when they hit, if you don't get it during the pre-order and get it during when they actually are done. And that's putting it over $300. I think it's like $320, $330 or something like that. And yeah, that price point will put it out of a lot of people's price range. But if you can afford this price range, or if this is a price range you're already used to playing in, you gotta get this. You just have to. Even with the changes from going to a hollow grind, honestly, I love flat grinds. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to buy one of these, because I own this, and this is in so many ways the exact same knife. And so in a lot of ways, it just feels like I don't need this. But man, one of the things I mentioned earlier is that the handle scale finish is different. And that alone kind of makes me want to get it, because a version of this in a stonewashed or tumbled handle and a belt satin rather than a hand satin, I kind of really need that. I kind of need that. I need that, right? I don't know. I'm not one to really buy duplicates of knives, and these are so freaking similar that I do think of it as kind of like a duplicate, but a slightly different handle finish and a different blade grind and blade finish. Yeah, that's different enough that I think I might be able to justify it. The real thing for me is if they come out with a version of this, the micarta, that's not in OD green. I'm just not an OD green person. So the reality is if they had in their initial drop a stonewash finish stonewash handle and micarta or fat carbon or some other material here that wasn't OD green, I wouldn't be hesitating. I would buy it in a heartbeat, even with I owning this, because I love this design to death. I love it to death, and that it's just so freaking good. And so that would be enough of a difference to me that I would immediately buy it. As is, I'm still on the fence. I don't know. I probably will. If you don't own one of these, I definitely think you should get one of these. If you do own one of these, I don't know. Maybe you're crazy like me and will buy two. If they end up changing this to a hollow grind for this production run, and I don't get in on it, or let me rephrase, because I think I'd get in on it anyway. But if you're the one of the people that's holding out and they because of the fact that it doesn't have hollow grind, and if they do end up changing that, oh man, you're gonna really be kicking yourself for missing it. Yes, this is, I think, going to be a big hit for them. I don't know if it's going to be as big of a hit as the F5.5, but compared to any other custom production type thing that they've ever done, I think this is the most potential to be an F5.5 level rave success for them of anything they've done. And so I'm sure we'll do more versions. And so part of me kind of wants to skip this just to wait out for whatever version of micarta they eventually do. But I know it's so far out. These are already going to come in very end of the year, maybe beginning of next year in terms of production, because Riot just has such long lead times that I don't know if I want to wait that long. But it might be the kind of thing where I get in on one of these production versions now and end up trading it for a different version if they do release like a natural micarta version, or even better, something like the blue denim micarta. Oh my god, if they did the blue denim micarta, I love it. Whew. Okay. I gotta stop talking because this is just going on for too long. At the end of the day, my final thoughts is I think this is one of the best overall designs in the EDC space that's come out in ages. Is one of my favorite knives, period. This production version is so similar that if you like this design, I think you owe it to yourself to try this. Do I want them to add the hollow to this? Yes. Are there things about this that I would change? Yes. You'll notice that though, that almost all of the little things are things that I said they actually did better here. The jimping, the simplicity there, the slightly additional amount of thickness, the pivot collar, the blade finish itself. There's so many little things about the production version that I think are just a little bit better. But I absolutely adore this, and I think I just, in doing this conversation, I think I'm talking myself into buying both. I need to stop talking in case that's really what's happening. No, I'm just going to do it, aren't I? I'm just going to do it. Okay. All right. I got to stop going. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you, Urban EDC, for lending me this my way. If you end up getting back to me and answering all those questions, Trevor, huge thank you for taking the time to do that. If you don't, I understand. You're super busy. Anyway, everyone, I'll catch you guys next time.